I asked myself, why in the world do I want to tell my story? Why would anybody care? Why would anybody care about my journey? Why about my life, my story? Why would anybody care about that? Everybody has a story. So why do I want to tell mine? As I asked myself that question, I said, I need to tell my story, not because my story is any better than anybody else's, because my story is any more unique, any more fascinating. I don't have this toe up from the flow up story, outhouse to the penthouse type of story. I was on drugs and alcohol and gang banging, and all of a sudden my life got better because I made these changes. That's not my story. My story is a journey, and so who cares about my story? The reason I decided that I needed to tell my story was because it is a story of healing. It's a journey of healing. And I know that my story is not special because it's so unique. It's special because it's every man's story. It's special because most of the men I know can relate to my story. But I also know most of the men I know will never tell their story. Most of the men I know suffer in silence. Most of the men I know deal with the invisible brokenness of manhood. They're broken on the inside, but manifesting wholeness on the outside. And so for me, I have learned how to take the lemons and turn them into lemonade. I've learned how to heal from my trauma, from my pain, from my loss, and be able to encourage that. And I want to be able to help other men who are on that same journey, who think that they can't. I like to say we need to come out from behind the tree of shame and be clothed in the redemptive garment of God's grace. God wants to give us a whole new wardrobe. He wants us to stop hiding in behind the rags, hiding behind the tree, saying, I'm not worthy. And he wants us to come out and say, I've given you a new identity and a new set of clothes, and I want you to embrace that life. And so for me, telling my story is every man's story. Mine is about healing, not hiding. So if I were to give my story a name, it would be the name how I sign almost all of my correspondence, and it is Humbled by His Grace. I am humbled how God has taken my brokenness and turned it into something that has helped men. I am humbled by the fact that God loves me enough and wants to use me to help other people. I'm humbled by a grace where God takes a bent nail and hammers it straight and puts it back into circulation. I'm humbled by a grace that God says, I use crackpots. I won't use dirty ones, but I'll use cracked ones. God's light said, I will shine through the cracks to help other people know. You may be a cracked pot, but you're not a crackpot. You may be a cracked pot, but you're still usable. And I heard someone say this recently, broken crayons still color. And so that's why I want to tell my story. I want other men, other people to experience through me, learn from my pain, learn from my struggles. You don't have to go through it to learn it. But if you are in it, I want men to know that there is light on the other side of the darkness. In the cloud where you are right now, there is sunshine on the other side of the cloud. There's hope outside the cave. So many men live their lives in the cave, and they don't realize that there's hope outside of it. They get stuck. I build couches in their dysfunction rather than ladders to get out themselves, and ladders to help them go back to help somebody else, and ladders to give other people the capacity to come out of those caves of dysfunction. And so if I were to tell my story as I tell my story, I call it humbled by his grace. So this is my story. Christmas 1956. My mother's first husband was killed trying to kill her and my older brother. He was an abusive alcoholic living in a little town called Hopkins Park, Illinois, about 56 miles south of Chicago. They lived in this house, a two-bedroom house, no running water, outhouse for a toilet, coal stove for heat, and 6 kids, 9 and under. And Christmas Day, he had told my mother not to buy the kids presents. And so he was out drinking on Christmas, and he came home, and my mother, I don't know what she had bought, couldn't have been that much, because she wasn't working and she didn't have any money, but she had gotten him something, and he came home and decided, he said, I told you not to, and he hit my mother. And then he was about to hit my older brother. And I guess my mother said, enough is enough, I'm tired of this. And she picked up something and clocked him and ran and took my brother with her. She ran across the yard to where my grandmother lived and ran into the house, where he picked up a gun and came up after her. Shot out the window to the house and came into the house and found my mother and my brother kind of hiding in the corner of a room. And he was about to shoot them. It just so happened that the neighbor from across the street was at the house because he was building a house. He was a sheriff from Chicago. And he was building a house across the street. And my grandmother let him stay on the porch when he built the house. He slept. And he came out and he warned him to put down the gun. He didn't. Sheriff fired a warning shot at him, and he raised the gun to shoot, and the sheriff shot him and killed him. Leaving my mother with 6 children, 9 and under, in a house with a hand pump for water. I'm not even sure if it was inside. The hand pump might have been outside. But with a hand pump for water, an outhouse, the toilet was a chair with a hole in it and a bucket and a coal stove to heat the house, and no job. So now my mother is alone, and she has 6 kids, and somebody came to check on my mother, checking on Sister Perry. Well, they checked a little bit too closely, and oops comes Jason. So I was the mistake. I wasn't supposed to be there. So now my mother has 7 mouths to feed. That was my origin. That was how I came to be. What was interesting was that some kind of way my mother was able to hide my father's identity. I don't know how you do that with 6 kids, 9 and under, but nobody knew who my father was. And then when I turned, so I went through the first 16 years of my life not having any idea. And I became a skilled liar. I could tell all kind of wonderful lies about where my dad was, and it was a little bit embarrassing. And plus, I didn't want people to know, wait a minute, your mama don't know who your daddy is, that kind of thing. So I just came good at deflecting, lying, and everything else. 16 was probably the most pivotal year of my life for a number of reasons. And maybe at some point throughout the story, I'll talk about some of those, what I call big rocks that changed my life at 16. But it's on my 16th birthday, my mother came to me and she said, there was a young lady in my church that I liked, that we were very close, and we weren't boyfriend and girlfriend, but I think we were headed that way. Beautiful young lady, or it happened to be my pastor's daughter. And my mother came to me and said, you can't be in a relationship with her. I said, why not? Because that's your niece. I'm like, oh? My niece? So if you tell him, she says, Big Rev is your dad. So my pastor's father was my father. What's funny is that I've never said that out loud, what I just said. And this young lady was my niece. And so I ended that. Needless to say, I had a hard time focusing in geometry that day. But so now I have this massive secret that my pastor is my brother and my pastor's father is my father. But my father never, ever acknowledged me. Matter of fact, flat out denied it. I'd given my life to the Lord at that point, made some significant changes in my life, and our families were extremely close. My pastor was my father figure, my role model. When our house burned in 1967, me and my mother went to go live with them. And for a period of time when we were all split up, 2 sisters went to stay with somebody, 3 of my brothers went to stay with somebody else, and my older brother went off to college, eventually to Vietnam. And so at some point after about 6 months, we came back together. I decided it wasn't worth the destruction of our families. He didn't want me anyway, so I just buried it. And from that point on, from 16 on, nobody knew the truth. November of 2009, somebody came to my church, or somebody preached at my church, and they talked about a story in the Bible, or a concept in the Bible called the year of Jubilee. And what the year of Jubilee was that every 50 years, the children of Israel were supposed to free all slaves, forgive all debts. They were supposed to not plant, not harvest, let the ground lie fallow. And they were supposed to simply this year, it was like the Sabbath day. The year of Jubilee was every 50-year massive Sabbath day. And so they talked about that. And then somebody in my small group said to me, I don't understand this year of Jubilee thing. So I explained what it was again. And I said, it's kind of like God hitting the reset button, saying nobody should live their entire life enslaved or in debt. And that's how I explained the year of Jubilee. It was a massive reset button for the country. Refocusing on God and being set free and starting over. That night when I got home, again, this was in 2009, which meant I was 49 years old. November. And that night when I got home, God said to me, next year is your year of Jubilee. You turn 50. This is your year of Jubilee. Nobody lives in debt, and nobody lives a slave all their life. You need to deal with this issue with your father so you can be set free from that bondage. It meant that I needed to deal with that. First thing I did was that I'm a writer, and I process the world through a pen and through my fingers and just putting words together. Went off to a lodge, a camp, and I sat in the basement and I wrote for 8 hours straight. And I wrote and I cried and I prayed, and I wrote and I cried and I prayed, and I wrote and I cried and I prayed. And I wrote something called My Journey Towards Truth. All of these different truths that I had seen, and as I wrote this document, I just got some significant insight about what I was supposed to do and how I was supposed to live and how this was supposed to affect me. I can tell you one of the lessons that I learned, and maybe one of the most significant lessons I've ever learned, is that you cannot heal until you reveal what's been concealed. And so so many of us hide stuff, but we're trying to cover up cancer with a bandage. Okay, yeah, I've hidden it, and nobody sees it, but I'm still sick. And God said to me, you've been hiding stuff for 50 years, for 34 years. It's time to reveal it so you can heal from it. So one of the applications of that for me was that I sat down and I wrote a letter to my father's daughter, my sister, who knew me as well. My father was old enough to be my grandfather. So his daughter was my mother's age. I went and I wrote this letter. And I called her up and I said, I need to talk with you. Can I come see you? She said, what this is about? I said, let's just talk when I see you. And so she said, you got me nervous because you've never done that before. So I went to go see her. We sat there and I read her the letter because I'd written the letter and I still have it. And I said, guess who's coming to dinner? I'm your brother. And I said, but let me explain something. Explain the circumstances. I said, I don't want anything from you. I don't want your name. I don't want an explanation. I don't want an apology. I don't want inclusion. I don't want inheritance. I don't want acknowledgement. I don't even care if you believe me. But I need to do this for my own well-being and for my children. Because at that point, my children were 13 and 10. And I'd lied to them their entire lives. My daughter would come to me, you know how kids do, and they do the family tree. Well, she would always come and she'd say, well, Daddy, I know Mama's Big Mama, and I know Granddaddy, and I know your mom, but who's your daddy? For a long time, I said, I don't know. Then after a while, I would say, well, I do know, but I can't tell you. So there was this big, massive hole in the family tree that some crazed bonsai had just kind of knocked that part out. So I'd lied to my kids their entire lives about my father. I said, I need to be able to tell my children the truth. So this isn't about you. This is about my children. So I don't want anything. I think she believed me, but I'm not sure. But because her dad was so revered, she didn't even want me to say anything to her siblings. And she didn't want to tell her siblings. She says they couldn't handle that, to know that Dad had a baby 40 years ago and didn't acknowledge it, and he's the pastor and all of that. So she really didn't want to tarnish, I call it, she didn't want to tarnish the statue. She didn't want a bird pooping on the statue. So she didn't ask me to bury it. She just didn't really want to do anything with it. And I was like, that's cool. So I left it. But then January 1, 2000, my year of Jubilee, I set my children down. We didn't go to church, and we sat at the kitchen table. I told them the truth for the very first time about my dad. I remember this response. My son, who could be very aloof, was just basically like, yeah, well, he was 10. Yeah. But I remember my daughter, to whom I'm very close, I remember her sitting there crying. And I didn't ask her why. I just let her cry. 2 days later, I was talking with her in the car, picked her up from school or something. I said, why did you cry when I told you that? She said, I'll never forget her response. It was very touching. She said, I cannot imagine anybody not wanting my daddy. And yeah, that was just a powerful thing, because she had picked up on, you've been rejected. And how in the world could anybody reject my daddy? You know, and that was a sign of our closeness. But that was the first time I told them the truth. But that was also significant for me, because when God began to speak to me and said, tell your story, one of the things that he said to me was, somebody needs to hear your story. This is holding back your ministry. You holding this is holding back your ministry. Didn't know what it meant. But I knew that's what he said to me. So I said, okay. So I told my story to my children, at least that little bit of it. A little while after that, I was working at this church and I was new to the staff. And they were having a weekend service, and God was dealing with me about this stuff because this was brand new to me. And I was learning different things about me and about what I was thinking, what I was drinking. And so I just shared a little bit of it with the staff. I said, man, these are some things that I'm learning right now. And we were doing a service that weekend called Renewal. It's kind of like, sort of like revival, but it wasn't like the typical revival, but it was like opportunity to come and to really focus up in on God. What is God doing in your life and leaning into that? So when I said that to the staff, they said, can you share some of what you just shared at church? And I went, okay, I can share some of it. I wasn't planning on telling them everything. I just wanted to tell them a little bit. So I got to service that weekend. We were doing worship, and I was sitting on the front row. And you keep hearing me say, God said to me, God speaks to me. I mean, we talk, just I hear him. And God said to me so clearly, tell your story. And my response was, nah, I'm good. I ain't doing that. So, and we had a fight right there in the front row during worship. And I'm going back and forth. Jason, tell your story. I ain't doing that. I ain't ready to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't know these people well enough to do that. No, I'm good. Leave me alone. I'm not doing it. He said, tell your story. I was like, I finally like, okay. After he slapped me upside my head a couple of times, I said, okay. I got up and I shared a little bit. First time ever publicly talking about truth that I had hidden for 34 years. And the room was just weeping. People were weeping. I'm like, what are y'all crying about? It's just my story. What's the problem? After service, there were people lined up to talk to me. And there was this one lady standing off to the side, off to my left. She was at the front, but she was over by herself, and it was obvious that she was waiting on me. And so she waited till everybody left, and it was just me and her. It was right downstairs. Just me and her standing in the sanctuary. And she slowly kind of edged her way over and stood right next to me, kind of almost shoulder to shoulder. And she said, when I was 13, I had a baby. But I never saw the baby because my mother immediately took the baby. As soon as she was born, my mother took her and gave her away. And she said, I'm 63. Do the math. 50 years. She said, because you have the courage to tell your story, I now have the courage to tell mine. You're the first person I've ever told about this. I went, wow. I watched this lady life change. She only wore dark clothes, always wore a dark hat, never smiled. Just kind of was present, but just was like a cloud. I watched her completely change. She smiled. She joined the praise team. She joined the choir. She began volunteering to take care of children during the coffee break Bible study. Completely different person. We never talked about it again. But we would see each other in the hall in the church, and we just looked at each other, just nod and smile, and that was it. I had tried one more time to have a conversation with my mother about my dad, but at that point, the Alzheimer's had kicked in, and I had no idea what was truth and what she was saying to me. But in my life, we had only had 3 conversations about my father, none of which ended well, because my mother just would not talk about it. She'd shut down. She said something, and I tried to see if I could get a moment of lucidity out of her. And what's amazing is that she continued to say, yeah, that's your dad. And it's like, wow. what's kind of interesting about that is that she didn't have a whole lot of moments of lucidity. And so this particular time she started talking, I went, wait a minute, Mom's making sense. So I secretly pulled out my phone and put it on record. And my mother got up and went to the bathroom. And I went, oh man, she's gonna come back Olivia. She ain't gonna come back Mom, she's gonna come back this other person. But she came and sat back and she kept talking. And I recorded it. I was like, I finally got her on tape saying it. And in my excitement, I forget to hit save. December, my mother died. That was the last conversation I had with my mother about that. And she died December 20th, 2010. And I remember saying my year started with me revealing my dad and the year ended with me losing my mom. Well, about a month later, I was sitting in church and somebody came up and whispered in my ear right before I got up to go into the pulpit. Somebody came and whispered in my ear, Sister Francine died last night, went to sleep and just didn't wake up. That was a lady who had told me she had the baby 50 years ago. And I stood up to the pulpit and I got up there and the grief hit me. And I cried for 5 minutes standing in the pulpit. I couldn't talk. I just cried. Nobody had any idea what was wrong with me. Maybe the person who had just whispered in my ear knew. But I could not communicate at that point. And when I finally did, what was going through my heart was this. I didn't tell people this. I think there were two things that were happening to me. One was sneak grief, because my mom had died a month earlier. And I think this grief just hit me because she reminded me of my mom. Not physically, but just in terms of life story and difficulties and things. And I think it reminded me of my mom. And so it's just like, wow, my mom just died. And it hit me. But the bigger thing that hit me was what God had said to me a year earlier. This is holding back your ministry. Somebody needs your story. And what hit me was that Fran said to me, because you have the courage to tell your story, I have the courage to tell mine. And she told me her story, and it set her free. Okay, I'm hoping I don't cry now. Because what I realized at that point was that if I hadn't told my story, Fran would have died in her chains. And she would have died in her grief, her embarrassment, her shame. But because I had the courage to tell my story, it set her free. And she died whole. And God said, that's what I was talking about. Earlier that year, about the same time that my staff asked me to share my story with the congregation, a friend of mine who was living in Florida, who was the fatherhood coordinator for social service agencies that work with social service agencies that work with mothers and children, called me up and he said, Jay, I'm the fatherhood coordinator of this agency. I'm the only man in the organization. They finally figured out that fathers are important to the family because most of these agencies that work with women and children ignore fathers. Matter of fact, a lot of them even see fathers as the problem. And so as he said, my job is to help them incorporate fathers and understand the importance of fathers. He said, they're scalping me down here. He said, I need some help. I don't know why he called me. To this day, I've asked him, why did you call me? He says, I don't know. But he called me and he said, can you come do a workshop for me to talk about fathers? He has no idea what I'm dealing with in my own life. None. And I go down and I do this workshop. And I titled the workshop, Do We Really Need Dads? And I won't go into all of the details, but some of the women were extremely angry with him for bringing me, and extremely angry with me for coming. He called me up a little while later and he said, some of those ladies who were the most upset about you, what you shared, have made a complete 180. And they are now the biggest advocates for male involvement and for paternal involvement. That workshop was the catalyst for a major change in that organization. They became one of the nation's leaders in paternal involvement. Started a conference called Affirming Fatherhood Conference. The agency, when I went there was maybe 20 employees. Today there's about 100. And I was a catalyst as they began to shift. What I shared with them about the importance of dads came out of my own story and what God was doing in me. And that has turned into a national ministry for me. I just published a book called Dads and Diamonds Are Forever that came out of that. But 2 summers ago, that story took a turn. Summer of 2023, my story took a turn. Because I realized even at that point, even after, 13 years of being okay with who my dad was, and I still didn't have closure because as I said earlier, I had never said his name publicly. Because I just kind of hid it. I protected the family and I protected the story because I just had a couple of people telling me this truth, but I had no evidence of it. There was no closure for me. And I realized that all of the people who really know the truth are dying. So I went back to the same sister that I had talked to years earlier, but she was sickly. And we went to have lunch and her son brought her. I thought she would come and meet me, but her son brought her who did not know the story. So I really didn't want to out it so I just kind of I said, hey, you know what, we'll get together lunch next month or later and talk some more. And I'll pick you up because I just wanted to talk to her one-on-one. She died before we could meet. And now I'm like, snap, ain't nobody left. How do I get closure on this? There is nobody left. There's only one person left. But she had a son. And her son was the only male left in the line, in the whole line of the family. His mother died. He's very close to his mother. So I said, well, I'm going to give him a little time to grieve. But I need a favor from him. After about a month and a half, 2 months, I called him up. I said, hey, can we have lunch? Can we have coffee? He said, yeah. So we got together for coffee. And I handed him the letter that I'd handed his mother almost 14 years earlier. And he read it and went, oh, wow. Because this is his grandfather that I'm talking about. And he says, okay, what do you need from me? I said, I want closure. He says, how can I help you get closure? I said, I need a DNA test. I need to know for sure, what happened. What is the truth? He said, sure. When do you want to do it? I said, I got the test in the car. I had already ordered the test. I ordered them and they were sitting in the car. I said, all I need you to do is sit and spit and I'll mail it. So we went to my car, did the swab, did the spit in the tube, mailed it, and on my way home, put it in the mail. So I'm thinking, okay, in a couple of months I'll get the results back, and I'll have DNA proof that he's my dad, Alvin's my nephew. DNA test come back, and it says he's your cousin. It's my cousin? No, he's not my cousin. His grandfather. I looked, looking at how the DNA test, the chart, and father and all stuff like, your parents are you're gonna have 50% of your parents. Your siblings is gonna be a quarter, up to about 25%. And then, but he fell in the cousin range. It's like, how is he my cousin? So I looked at it and I'm like, if you're my cousin, that means our parents were brother and sister. So I know your mom. That means your mom's brother is my father. Well, there's only one brother that had a relationship with my mother. And I went, oh, snap. Because it turns out that my pastor, who I thought was my brother, was actually my father. That was my summer surprise. So after 63 years of believing one person was my father, I found out that one of the most significant men in my life had lied to me for 40 years. He was my brother. He was my father figure. I revered him. He was my friend, and he was also my father. And that was so complicated because our relationship had deteriorated over the years. I went back and I worked with him. And this is always hard for me to tell this part of the story because it just feels bad for me to say this, but it's the truth. He became very intimidated by my ability. And we worked together very closely. I literally worshiped the ground this man walked on, but he hurt me significantly. He said to me, you need to suppress your leadership gifts. Not you need to elevate. We need to develop. You need to suppress your leadership gifts. His fatal flaw, he was a great man, but his fatal flaw was his pride. And he would tell you, if I'm not leading it, I ain't in it. Would not follow, would only lead. And if you were a strong man, you didn't survive being with him. And I saw that over the years. All of the strong men in the church left. He got in his head that I wanted the church and that I wanted to take over. So he did everything he could to keep me under his thumb, and just said and did a lot of things that was extraordinarily damaging to me. One of the things that was damaging, the thing that he said to me that was the most damaging, he said it publicly. As I look back upon it later, maybe just even in the last 5 years or so, I realized it was the single most damaging thing that anybody has ever said to me. I can look at the impact. I'll talk about that a little bit later, the impact upon me. But he called me before the church Absalom. And Absalom was David's son. And Absalom was David's son who David saved from execution. They kind of put him on house arrest. But Absalom turned on him and, in a very sneaky, surreptitious way, turned the kingdom against David. And he called me Absalom. When I was 14, I went off to high school. The community I was in did not have a high school. It was very poor. probably 40% unemployment, most of the roads were dirt. I was 7 before we had indoor plumbing, heat, toilet, water in our house. The high school we went to was in the neighboring community of St. Anne. St. Anne was a white Dutch community. The only color there were the tulips that was grown and the migrant farmers who came to pick them. So it was a white community. My freshman years, we drove into town. We were bused into town. My freshman year, the headlines of the papers were, "We don't want the blacks here." That's how I entered high school. First year, we went to school, you got off the bus, went in the building, you were banned, you were prohibited from crossing the street. You could not do anything but get off the bus, go into the school, come out of the school, get on the bus. I only crossed the street because I played football and there was a Dairy Queen on the corner. And when we had two-a-days, we could go to the Dairy Queen, but you could not go any step further. I was an adult before I knew they had a downtown. My sophomore year, there was a fight between black kid and a white kid, black boy and a white boy, and the school freaked out. It's going to be a race riot. It's just boys being boys. They freaked out, said it was going to be a race riot, and they closed the school, shut the school down. I think they shut the school down for 3 weeks. While they shut the school down, when they shut the school down, all these kids are out of school. When my pastor opened up the church, and there were a lot of unemployed, retired, or volunteer teachers, and he said, "Come to the church, and you'll do classes at the church." And so, just so kids didn't get so far behind. Well, when the school opened back up 3 weeks later, they had police dogs in the hall, police cars on the street, and many of us refused to go back under those conditions. Like, why in the world would we go with police dogs? We didn't do anything. 30 of us said, we're not going back under those circumstances. And the superintendent of the school put pressure on the parents, said, if your kids don't come back, they're truant, you'll be arrested. And they believed him and they caved. My pastor told them, you're in school. Even if you call it homeschool, that you have the right to do this. But they didn't believe him and they caved, except for 4 of us. 4 of us said, we ain't going back. And we ended up creating a high school with 4 students, the Christian Institute for Developing Altruistic Leaders. So we had a freshman, 2 sophomores, and a junior. It was the whole school. As I look ahead of those 4 students, Alpha probably would have been the first black valedictorian in the history of the school. Today, she's the president of the American Bar Association. I was a starting quarterback on the football team. Brian and his brother were both on the basketball team. I was the MVP of the football team that year. And they wouldn't even let us come back into the building to get our books, to get anything. We were banned from the building, but we made this commitment to this school. And the school, so we started a high school with 4 students. Significant pivotal point in my life because we stood for something and we sacrificed for something that we believed in. Pivotal. I ended up not finishing there because he was afraid. He said, I don't know where this is going to go, and I don't want to risk your future. So he wouldn't let me come back the second year. I was committed to going back to that community. So I got a degree from the University of Illinois, and I went back to that community to work in that same community, making about $11,000. I think my salary was $11,400. You say, oh, well, that was no, that was well below poverty level. But I was absolutely committed to that community, and I was committed to him. And so I went back, I worked in the church. I was a deacon in the church. Over the years, I stopped counting at 40 jobs that I turned down to stay there and work. My wife and I were the youth leaders at the church. That became a contentious issue because you're just trying to get these kids so that you can break off and start your own church. It's like, I don't care what I did. It was, you're trying to take over. But I stayed because I was absolutely committed. When my wife and I first started dating, our second date, I brought her out to Hopkins Park, Pembroke Township. I use those words and those names interchangeably. And I drove her around all the worst places. Took her down the dirt roads, no lights, bumpy roads, showed her the trailers, showed her the house that I'd grown up in, the little shack and all of that. And my words to her was simply, this is me. I needed her to understand I'm not going anywhere. I'm not looking to escape. This is my life. This is what I do. This is what I'm giving my life to. But I needed her to understand that from the beginning. I'm happy. I'm good. That was my level of commitment to that community, to that church. My senior year in college, we were building a new building. Set up my schedule so that I came home every Friday my senior year in college. I drove from Champaign to Hopkins Park every Friday so that I could help build the church physically. Because we had started the process. We fired our contractors. And we said the men of the church will finish building the church. And me and my pastor worked side by side the entire last year, laying tile, laying electrical, drywall, everything. Not a part of that building I hadn't touched. Because that was my level of commitment to that community and to that church and to him. When my wife and I started dating, she made 3 times what I made. And for me to have that level of commitment to him, to that church, to that community, and for him to say to me, you're Absalom, was the single most damaging thing that has ever been said to me. Took me probably 25 years to finally heal from that. Had significant damage in my life. I would write down later, I could very clearly identify the damage. But that was our relationship. But what I recognized was that when I found out that he was my father, there was a level of betrayal in that was so significant. And there was a level of betrayal to my family because my whole family, all of my siblings grew up under him. And we knew what he stood for. And this is getting personal, but I guess all of this is personal. But he was very strict, very, by the book. And if a woman got pregnant in the church out of wedlock, she had to come before the church and apologize and confess it. Well, he made my sisters, both of my sisters got pregnant, and they had to do that. I think his daughter got pregnant, his oldest daughter. I think she had to do it. So I have a family call with my siblings since 2020. Every Monday, we've met on a Zoom call for like 4 years, nonstop. We've talked about a whole lot of stuff that we had never talked about before, but it's just made us very close. So when I revealed to them this, I had to talk them off the ledge because it was a family betrayal. To say, wait a minute, you made us stand before the church and confess? And you got our mother pregnant? The level of betrayal of that was significant. As I think about the trauma in my own life, and it was friendly fire because it came from a father figure. It came from a mentor. It came from an idol. It came from a role model. My brother talked about being in Vietnam in '68, how dangerous it was in Vietnam, not from the Viet Cong, but from friendly fire. The level of racism that you dealt with in the Army in Vietnam in 1968 at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. He says a whole lot of those men who were killed were not killed by the Viet Cong. They were killed by friendly fire. You have to worry about who was in front of you and you have to worry about who was behind you. The damage that my pastor did to me was friendly fire, because there was nobody else more in my life more important than him. And I realized that it created in me a wounded warrior. And I often talk to men now about being a wounded warrior. A wounded warrior does not mean you're perfect. It means that you're going into battle, you're limping, but you're limping and you're helping somebody else. I'm still fighting, and I'm wounded, but I ain't bleeding. I have one sister who knows everything. She's the one who's supposed to be here today. And I called her up and I said, you might want to pull over if you're driving, because I got to tell you this. And I told her, and she went, oh. And she said, okay, I need to pull over. But she asked me a couple of days later, are you okay? I said, no, I'm okay. I said, this is a blow, but it will not draw blood. I had to start rethinking everything and recognize that these were not just church wounds. These were daddy wounds. That's different. And what did I believe and what did I think and all of those things, and then talking my family off the ledge who were just livid and angry. And so how do I respond to those things? And how do I deal with that? All of that. And I said to my sister, she thought I was just being spiritual or kind of suppressing my feelings. I said, no, I'm not suppressing my feelings. My feelings are my feelings. But what I've learned is that there's a reason that things happen in my life, and it's not just for me, is that this is one more thing for me to be able to take men through to say, this is how you heal from a blow. So as I look at that, how do I use my story to help others? I need to tell my story because this is every man's story. Not every man has that, but so many men have that story of daddy wounds, parent wounds, trauma, community trauma, family trauma, historical trauma. And I was sitting in my office and I cleared the whiteboard. I'm a whiteboard person. That's how I think. I stand at a whiteboard and I sketch out ideas and talk and write. And I asked God, what has been the purpose of my journey? This is what he said to me. He said, Jason, I've given you a story. Everybody has a story. He says, step one, I've given you a story. 2, he says, I've given you the ability to learn lessons from your story. Not everybody learns lessons from their story. Everybody has experiences, but most people do what I call pinballing. If you ever played the classic game of pinball, you got the flippers and you got the big steel ball and it goes into the arena and it hits the bumpers and it makes a lot of noise, a lot of flashing lights, a lot of chaos. And eventually you tilt and you go back and you start again and you do it all over again for some artificial adrenaline rush of, look at what I've accomplished, until somebody else beats your high score. That's how most people go through life, pinballing. To go from experience to experience to experience. Lots of noise, lots of flash, lots of dash. With this artificial high of, look at what I've accomplished, until somebody else comes along and I got to come back and I'm chasing something that really doesn't have a lot of value, but I haven't learned anything. I'm just making a lot of traveling and a lot of noise. And it is that God says, you're not pinballing, you're learning. You can point, what did you learn from that pain? What did you learn from that situation? What did you learn from that person? He says, I've given you this ability to extract lessons from everything that happens in your life. I can complain and I can talk about my father and my pastor. But I wouldn't be the man that I am today if it wasn't for him. I can eat the fish and throw out the bones. There's a lot of good fish meat. There were some bones that would have killed me if they got stuck in my throat. But I can acknowledge the goodness of the fish and navigate around the bones. I'm not going to deny the goodness of the fish. But I'm also not going to deny the reality of the bones. And so as I look at that, yeah, I've learned stuff. There are things that the way I lead now, I've learned from how he led. I've learned good and I've learned bad. I learned what I want to do and I learned what I don't want to do. Someone asked me one day when I was sharing my story with them, they said, what would you like to change? If you could go back and change something, what would you change? And I thought about it and I said, I wouldn't change a thing. He said, really? I said, yep. Why? Because if I change one thing, I got to change everything. If I don't answer my phone on this day as a senior in college, I don't get the call that asks me, can you give Sharon a ride to school, to the bus station? If I don't give her a ride to the bus station, I don't meet my wife. I don't meet my wife, I'm a different person. I change anything, I change everything. I've learned that what describes you does not have to define you. What defines you is what you do with what describes you. So he says, I've given you a story. I've given you the ability to learn from your story. So I've learned lessons and I've captured this whole compendium, this whole encyclopedia of life lessons. The good, the bad, and the ugly, it all makes me me. Third thing, so you got a story, I've given you the ability to learn from your story. Third thing, I've given you the courage to share your story. Many people will not share their story. They have lessons they've learned. They have experiences they have, but they won't tell their story. As I said earlier, they hide behind the tree of shame. They hide behind it because they're fearful. They hide behind it because they're embarrassed. They hide behind it because they're angry, but they will not tell their story. I think of a lady I met in Denver many years ago. She was the quintessential church lady, sat on this end of the row, second seat, second row on my left every single Sunday. I heard her one day telling somebody in the church that she was going to be sharing her testimony and her story with her Sunday school class. Her story was that she was in adult films for years before she got saved. But now God had delivered her from that. And now she had 2 teenage daughters, young teenagers. I said, you're going to tell your daughters that before you tell your Sunday school class that, right? She said, oh, no, I would not. I'm not telling them that story. I don't want them to know that. I said, do you want them to find out at school as their friends are talking about it at school? Because you know the mother, I said, you want your daughters to find out you were an adult film star from their friends at school? You know how evil, how cruel kids are going to be? That's how you want them to find out? I can't tell them that story. I'll never tell them that. I said, you're going to lose your daughters if you don't. I'm not telling them. Several years later, I ran into her at my son's baseball game. We were sitting at the game and I sat down next to her. I hadn't seen her in a while. I said, how's it going? And she talked to me about how she lost her daughters. Her daughters had both become pregnant at like 13, 14, 15 years old because they were very angry. They said, you lied to us. You're a faker. You're a poser. You're a hypocrite. You sit in church and then you keep this secret and you're lying. She lost her daughters. And she sat there, she lamented at me, sitting at a baseball game, because she did not have the courage to tell her story. I remember back when Francine said to me, because you have the courage to tell your story, I have the courage to tell mine. And your courage has set me free. Many people don't. And God says, I've given you the courage to do that. But this fourth one is extraordinarily important, is that you have the capacity to tell your story, both written and oral. I've given you this ability to write. I've given you this oral ability to tell. But I've also given you the ability to tell your story in a way that is a blessing, not a bane. That when people leave you, they don't feel hurt, they feel helped. They feel hope. There's a lot of people who have a story, tell their story, learn from their story, tell their story, but they do what I call emotional vomiting. When a baby vomits, when you vomit, if your stomach is upset, you throw up, your stomach feels better. But the person on whom you threw up needs a bath. My sisters, my brothers tell me a story that when I was a little boy, 7 years between me and my next brother. And they tell me the story that one of my brothers one day was playing with me and held me over his head, and he's jostling me around, and I just vomited right on his head. I'm sure he didn't go, oh, that's so cute. It's like, no, you little, because I felt okay, but he needed a bath. Too often people will tell their story with no filter, with no point to it. Yes, I feel better. I told you my story, but you leave there limping, looking for a shower. I call that emotional vomiting. And God has said, I've given you the ability not to do that. I haven't talked to anybody who I've shared my story with that had come away and said, other than, man, that helped me. Didn't hurt me, it helped me. So for that reason, I said, for those 4 reasons, God says, this is the purpose of your journey. To help men heal from their broken past. And to prepare them to live productively in the future. That's why I tell my story. I want men to know you don't have to live in that dysfunction. You don't have to live in that darkness. And you don't have to deny its reality. The issue of healing is a major part for me. You cannot heal until you reveal what's been concealed. I still hold him in high regard. He died with our relationship being a bit broken because up until the time he died, he always was taking little swipes at me. And I finally made the decision the last time I saw him, you're not hurting me anymore. I'll love you from a distance, but I'm not getting close enough for you to hurt me anymore. I was going through some pictures maybe about a year ago, and I came across a picture of me and him and my children. I saw the picture and I threw it in the garbage. And about 2 days later, I went in the garbage and got it out. I told my wife about it. And I said, no, I need to take it out the garbage. I hadn't thrown it out. It was just in the garbage can. I said, I need to take it out. It's for a couple of reasons. The primary reason, because I realized it was the only picture that my children would have of their grandfather, because it was the only picture we'd ever taken together. But a picture is a snapshot. It stops time, literally stops time. So in a continuum of time, a picture is a snapshot of time, and it stops it. So if I do this and hold up 2 fingers, or hold up these fingers like this, it stops time. And you take a picture of it. What you don't know is what preceded it. What you don't know is what happened afterwards. So if you just see this, you just go, he's throwing up a gang symbol. Or he's from the University of Texas, hook 'em horns. Or he's doing sign language and he's saying, I love you. There was a young man that was shot on the highway in California, Los Angeles, I think it was. And the gangbangers who shot him on the highway were driving by and they saw it. They said, why did you shoot him? They said, he threw up a gang symbol at us. The kid was deaf. He was doing sign language and he was talking to somebody in the car. They saw that and killed him. did not understand context. And when I saw that picture, I understood the context. Anybody looking at the picture sees this good-looking couple and this man, this older gentleman, and these two little beautiful children, and they're smiling. When I saw the picture, I knew what had happened 2 hours before. I knew how he had just embarrassed me in front of my wife and my children. He had just ripped me because I was late getting to see him the day before, and he left because I was late. And I got to his house and he wasn't there. He didn't know why I was late. He just knew I was late. And when I saw him that day, he asked me to come. I said I reestablished I'll come the next day. And he asked me to come to the porch to talk to him. And I said, okay. And I told my wife, I said, I'll be right back. He said, no, bring your wife, bring your kids on out. So we go to the porch, and he proceeds to rip me and tell me how irresponsible I am because I wasted his time, because I didn't tell him I was going to be late. And he did that in front of my wife and my children. And out of respect, because I never disrespected him, I had to just kind of suck it up and go on. But we took that picture. He had cancer at that point. I think I knew that. When I took that picture, and I looked at this beautiful picture, I knew the context. I knew what had happened an hour and a half before. I knew even as I stood there and looked at my smiling face, I knew that I was saying, I will never see you again. And this is the last time I will ever come in your presence. I knew that was the end of our relationship. And he didn't know that. I never saw him again. He died a little while after that. This whole process of healing is important, of learning how do you heal those things that are concealed and how do you not allow them to define you. But one of the most significant parts of dealing with trauma in your life, one of the most significant things of dealing with hurt and pain in your life is the issue of forgiveness. And I think there are so many people that are sick, that are hurt because they don't understand forgiveness. So forgiveness is releasing a person from the debt that they owe you. It is saying, I will no longer carry the IOU that you have given me. So the moment that a person offends you, the moment they hurt you, the moment that a person does something like that, they incur a debt. They owe you an apology. They owe you an explanation. They owe you restitution. They owe you your childhood. You stole my childhood from me. You stole my innocence from me. You owe me that because you took something that didn't belong to you. They owe you that, but you are carrying, the one who is hurt is carrying the IOU. And the person who is carrying the IOU, the one person who gave the IOU, they can go about their business. Forgiveness is saying, once that debt happens, and once you incur that debt, you also incur all of the stuff that goes with that debt. Because what happens if they don't pay you? Now you're mad. You're bitter. You're going after them. You got revenge on your mind. Payback. You owe me. You owe me. Pay me. And you are the one who is in bondage to the person who created the debt. But to forgive the debt is to say, you don't owe me anything. I'm tearing up the IOU. And I'm going to tear up the emotions and the bondage that comes with that IOU. I have this thing that I don't loan anybody money. I never loan money. If I can't give it to you, I won't give it. Because once I loan it to you, now if you don't pay me back, I'm mad at you. And it's going to impact our relationship. We don't like forgiveness because we think that if I forgive you, I've removed all responsibility from you. I'm saying that what happened didn't happen. I'm saying that you owe me something and now I'm going to walk away from that. We don't like forgiveness because we want revenge. And we don't mind. The Bible tells us, revenge is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. We don't mind that verse. We just want to make sure that when the revenge happens, it comes with a gift card that says, this is because of what you did to Jason. Because we want revenge and we don't know how to operate sometimes without that. And so now forgiveness is being willing to let that go, let some of those things go. When I got my summer surprise 2 years ago, my father is dead. The grandfather's out the picture because he wasn't a player ever. He was just a light up on scapegoat, but he was never in the picture. So my father is dead. His family is dead. My mother is dead. There's only one person left who really knows the truth. And that's my father's wife, who my mother told me when I was 16, we've been talking, and we know you cannot be in a relationship with her, with my daughter. And so now when I go to my father's wife and say that, she's like, oh no, your mother's lying. I said, but I have DNA. Dana don't lie. And you tell me my mother is lying, and the word on the street about your mother's like, what are you talking about, my mama? And when all of this stuff, and she refuses to acknowledge the truth because she has to polish the statue of her husband. And I can't let you tarnish the reputation of my dear saint husband. And I said that, yes, there is a blow, but there does not draw blood, but there will be blowback. That was part of the blowback. But I realized in the blowback, it was starting to break the skin. And so one day the Lord woke me up 4:30 in the morning, and he said, I need you to go and study forgiveness. And I got up, and for the next few hours, I just had a Google list. Give me verses on forgiveness. And for a few hours, I just sat there and I read verse after verse after verse after verse on forgiveness. And I came out of that with 7 significant points, lessons on forgiveness. And when I looked at those things and I wrote those things down, I was able to say, I can forgive you for the pain, for the damage that you inflicted. Forgiveness is not just, it didn't happen. The Bible talks about Joseph in the Old Testament. And Joseph's brothers did him dirty. They inflicted some significant trauma upon him. They hated him. They sold him into slavery. Sold into this country, and he ends up a slave in Potiphar's house. And he gets thrown into prison and forgotten, and the people he helped in prison forgot him. So he is fallen, and he's years in prison for stuff that he didn't do. But because of God's favor on his life and his ability to interpret dreams, he ends up going literally from the outhouse to the penthouse. And now he's the vice president. He's the assistant pharaoh, associate pharaoh, second most powerful person in the country. He has 2 sons. He has a trophy wife, and he has a son. And he names his first son, I think it was Ephraim. And Ephraim means, and it might have been Manasseh, I always switch them around. But the first son's name meant, the Lord has made me to forget my family and my troubles. I'm going, really? So every time you call your son, you say, hey, come here, you who have made me to forget my family. And every time you call your son, you remember your family. But that's a coping mechanism for forgiveness, for our trauma. I'm going to act like this didn't happen. I'm just going to rewrite history, kind of like what's happening in our country right now, where we're saying, well, slavery was a good thing. Because people, I just saw a video this morning, PragerU, where they got these cartoons where they're rewriting history and they're saying, well, slavery was not a bad thing. It was good. Wasn't it better to be a slave than to die? And you're rewriting history. You know, Harriet Tubman was a farm worker. He helped people on farms get their rights. You see, they're saying there's a rewriting of history in order to cover trauma. And that's what Joseph did. He tried to cover his trauma by saying, I've forgotten my family. But that didn't work. And then he came back and he named his second son Manasseh. And Manasseh means the Lord has made me prosperous in the land of my grieving. I thought you had forgotten your family, so what are you grieving? Why are you still grieving? You're still grieving because you haven't healed from your pain. But you try to cover it up with wine, women, and song. And that's another coping mechanism for dealing with trauma. We cover up our pain with success, with work, with money, with possessions, with accomplishments. But all we're doing is putting the bandage on the cancer. And so God says, no, Joseph, I got a great work for you, but you're damaged, and I need you to be healed so that you can really do the work that I want you to do. So what does he do? He brings his brothers and puts his brothers in his presence. He reveals the trauma that's been concealed. And over the years that follow, God begins to speak to Joseph, and he teaches Joseph, let me show you what I was doing. I needed somebody on the inside of Egypt, somebody on the inside of this administration that could administer food and the wisdom to protect so that when this famine came, somebody was ready to protect my people. 20 years ago, I put this in place. I allowed this to happen so that you're here. And Joseph went, I see. I see what you were doing. And because of that, Joseph was able to forgive his brothers. And when his brothers showed up, and eventually, after several years, Joseph said, I'm Joseph. And he revealed himself to his brothers. And in revealing himself to his brothers, he said to them, don't worry. Don't forgive yourselves. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. You see, he had forgave them the debt. His brothers didn't say, Joseph, man, we messed up. Joseph, I'm so sorry. We shouldn't have. They didn't do any of that. Because forgiveness is not for the people who are forgiven. Forgiveness is for the forgiver. Forgiveness is saying, I will no longer carry the weight of your decisions. And so Joseph was able to speak kindly to his brothers. He was able to take care of his brothers and their families. And he was able to speak kindly to their hearts because he had let go of the need for revenge. He had let go of the need for an explanation. He had let go of the debt for his life and for his time in prison. He had let go of the need for that because he had said, God will handle that. And I trust him, but I'm going to live in freedom. I'm going to live in joy. I'm going to live without that. And the evidence that I can live without that is that I'm going to treat you and your family well. I'm not going to try to get revenge. I saw there was a party that I was invited to where I knew my father's wife would be there, the woman who had hurt me. The previous week, it was another party that I was supposed to go to. I know she would be there, and I didn't go because I didn't want to see her. But this one, I said, I'm not missing it because you're not controlling my life. And I told my wife, I said, this is what's going to happen. I said, I'm going to get there, and I'm going to see her. And she's short. She's like 5'1". I always called her shortcakes. I said, I'm going to see her. And I'm going to walk up to Shortcakes and I'm going to hug her. And I'm going to kiss her on top of her head. I'm going to tell her it's nice to see you. Sure enough, I'm talking to a friend and she walks up. She doesn't acknowledge me. She doesn't, she interrupts the conversation I was having to talk to the person that I'm standing and she doesn't even acknowledge me. And I walked over to her and I hugged her. And I kissed her on top of her head and I said, it's good to see you, Shortcakes. And I walked away. Because you see, one of the lessons that I learned is that she doesn't have the capacity to say, I'm sorry. She doesn't have the capacity to pay the debt that she or her husband owe me because she's trying to protect an image and a history and a legacy. And when you demand payment from someone who lacks the capacity or the capability to pay it, you risk diminishing your own self and dishonoring God. And it's like, I got to give you, God handles this, not me. It's one of the significant lessons I've learned about forgiveness. That me holding on to grudges is like planting dandelions and expecting to get a prize-winning lawn out of it. If I plant dandelions, I'm getting dandelions. I ain't getting fescue. I'm getting dandelions. So why would I expect to get anything less? That's what forgiveness is about. And that forgiveness is a massive part of the healing process. As I said before, what describes you does not have to define you. What defines you is what you do with what describes you. So my story is ongoing. I'm still learning, still processing. It is still, but will I live in this perpetual debt to people who can't pay it, to people who won't pay it? Or will I learn from my story and in order to help other people learn how to edit their story? Will I learn from my pain? Will I learn from my trust? For my trust. Will I learn from those things and say, now how can I take this and turn this into a life curriculum that I can help somebody else? Maybe the last thing I'll say about this is when the defecation hits the oscillation, when the feces hits the fan, life turns upside down and you have these difficult things, there is two questions you should be asking yourself. One, what is God trying to teach me about me? Second question is, what is God trying to teach me about him? And when we're asking those questions, I think that there are a couple of questions. There are about 4 questions that we should also be asking ourselves, or that we tend to ask during that season. The first question about God is, where is he? Why are you allowing these things to happen to me? Bad things aren't supposed to be happening to me. I'm a good person. And that indicates a pretty much, maybe almost a non-existent relationship with God, but a very poor one when we think that God has abandoned us. So where is he? Where are you? How could you let this happen? The next question that we might ask during that time is, why me? And that question is one where we're saying, why is this happening to me? I know that God is here, but this should be happening to me. And that's the indication of probably a pretty immature relationship with God, where we think that some kind of way bad things are not supposed to be happening because I gave $1 to a charity, because I gave $1 to a homeless person, because I go to church once a month. I mean, I'm a good person. Bad things aren't supposed to happen to me. The next question that we might have is, what are you teaching me? And that's a good question, because now it represents a level of introspection where you're saying, yeah, there's something that I'm supposed to be learning from this. And that's great when we have that level of awareness that I'm learning something. But that's still not the highest level of question we should be asking. The highest level of question we should be asking is, God, what do you want me to teach others as a result of this? The Bible says, at a time when you ought to be teachers, you are still yourself in need of being taught. That's a indictment of an immature person who is not learning from their life, who may be emotionally vomiting and pinballing, but they're not teaching and not helping anybody else. When you get to that level of your life and that level of understanding, you're saying, yeah, this hurts. Now, how do I teach somebody else from it? I'm going through this, and it's only wasted if nobody else benefits. That's the point that I'm trying to get in my life. That when the defecation hits the oscillation, rather than me blaming God and saying, you shouldn't do this to me, I'm saying, who will benefit from the lesson that I learned? What will I learn, and who can benefit? And how can I open the kimono on my life and say, look at me, I'm okay. I'm not perfect. I got the scars to prove it. That's the grace of God for me. And I'm humbled that God uses my life in such a significant way that 43 years I've been doing this. And I can look at people who have benefited from my lessons. And it's not because I'm so great, but because God is so great. And because he uses broken vessels. He uses broken crayons, still color. Bent nails can be reshaped. And broken vessels, cracked vessels, can still carry water and can allow its light to shine through them. So that's my story.